All right, we're back in the confession. Still moving through chapter 2, paragraph 1. And this morning, we are going to cover the eternity and immutability of God. And then I believe next week, Lord willing, Eric is going to cover the immensity and the Almighty. So let's turn, if you could, into the confession, chapter 2, if you have it. If not, I'm going to read so you can follow along listening. Chapter 2, paragraph 1. Try not to sneeze here from that. All right, sorry, hold on. All right. The Lord our God is but one living and true God, whose subsistence is in and of himself, infinite in being and perfection, whose essence cannot be comprehended by any but himself, a most pure spirit, invisible, without body, parts, or passions, who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, who is immutable, immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty, in every way infinite, most holy, most wise, most free, most absolute. We'll stop there. It was interesting, I was reading from the 13th century Lateran Council, so we're talking 1200s, and their definition of God is very similar to this. So it's very interesting to see that here this, otherwise a document we would wholly disagree with on almost every front, at least in its confessional statement at the beginning, before they get into all of their treatment of heretics and everything else, very solidly. So the church throughout history has held to what we're going to talk about this morning. So with that, we're going to talk about God's eternity and God's immutability. So if you would, let's turn to just a couple passages of Scripture to get started. So we're going to look at Isaiah 57, so let's start there. Isaiah 57. I'm reading from the NASB, however, I think I'm going to quote it as if it is from the KJV, because Isaiah 57, verse 15. For thus says the high and exalted one, who lives forever. If you have a KJV, I believe it says, who inhabits eternity. The dwelling place of God is eternity. He inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell on a high and holy place, and also with the contrite and lowly of spirit, in order to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. God inhabits eternity. Next, let's turn over to Psalm 90. Psalm 90. And we're going to look at verses 1 and 2. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. What we're going to look at this morning by looking at the doctrine of God's eternity and immutability is that understanding of God, which is absolutely fundamental to who He is. And if we mess this up, if we don't get this right, so many other things start to crumble and fall apart all around us. The doctrine of God's eternity is one that is throughout the scriptures. We're going to look in a little while at some other verses where we're going to see this eternity and immutability of God. And you're going to see how these two things go together, the eternity of God and the immutability of God. But the doctrine of God's eternity and of God's immutability has been assailed by philosophers and by theologians for centuries and centuries. They have attacked these two doctrines, and the denial of these things has been intended to rid us of the sovereign God of the Bible. That God in the Bible created us, owns us, rules over us, has the right to command us, and men don't like that. Obviously, men want to be the one who has the right to rule and the right to determine and the right to command and do as they please. And so to have this being who has this right over us and this control over us is something that we must rid ourselves of. And so theologians and philosophers have attempted for centuries to do that. It's important for us, I think, to recognize that very few people, I don't know what the percentage is. It's something like 0.00001. So there's a lot of zeros. Have ever read Hegel or Marx or Nietzsche or John Stuart Mill or Bertrand Russell. Most people don't read these men. These men have had a huge influence on our culture, and yet no one's read them. How is it possible that somebody like Bertrand Russell and John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant could have such an influence over our culture, and yet nobody reads them? Nobody could even probably understand them if they read them. And I think the reality is that these philosophers have such an influence over the culture because they give an argument to support what we already want to believe. If men don't like God having authority over them and commanding them and telling them what they should and should not do, then all that they need is somebody. Will somebody please make an argument that's at least rational, that if you make the argument, I can say, see, I'm justified in believing that there is no God who is over me and has control over me. No God who inhabits eternity and does not ever change. This is really how the elites gain influence over the culture. Harvard grads don't gain influence because they write stuff that's down here where everybody can grab hold of it and read it. They write stuff way up here where very few people read it, but it disseminates into, they give me an argument for something I already want to believe, something that I already think in my mind. They give it a sense of justification. They give belief justification. This morning, we're going to look at, and I'm going to do my very best. I brought this, Joseph helped me bring this whiteboard up here this morning. I'm going to do the very best impersonation of R.C. Sproul that I absolutely can do. What I'm going to talk about is coming from way before R.C. Sproul, but I'm going to try to do it in as R.C. Sproul-like a way as I possibly can, because I really, in honor of R.C. Sproul, I love R.C. Sproul and the way that he communicates on these subjects, on who God is, and on big, solid philosophical topics. He is, I think, one of the best, was one of the best, and is now seeing with his eyes what he could not see, but by faith before. We're going to go back to a Greek guy by the name of Parmenides. Parmenides was a philosopher, a Greek philosopher, around 500 and some BC. So he gets a lot of credit for coming up with some concepts that Moses wrote down long before Parmenides. But Parmenides happens to give a non-theological argument for what he argues, which we're going to look at this morning. Parmenides is attributed with the statement, whatever is, and whatever is not, cannot be. And what he did is he used this, what later in the Latin became this phrase. And you guys have seen this before. I'll try to write this big. Ex, out of, nihilo, nothing. So out of nothing. Nihil fit. Nothing comes. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Parmenides argued that the universe was eternal. That whatever is, and whatever is not, cannot be. And everybody thinks that Parmenides was really smart because he argued that the universe itself was eternal, that the stuff is eternal. He argued that nothing actually is becoming, that everything that is just simply is, it just being. And then somebody came along later and said, are you really seriously? There are things that are becoming. He argued that the river, as you stand beside a river, and you look into the river, at every moment, what you're seeing is a new river. Because the water just flowed away. It's not static. It's not just there. It moved. I'm looking at a new river now. A moment later, a new river. A moment later, a new river. As a matter of fact, I'm older than when I stood up here. I changed since I stood up here. I got grayer. I got older. I got deader. Right? Just since I started. I wrote that on the board. It didn't exist up there before. There's change. So Parmenides was challenged by other Greek philosophers who were even his contemporaries and said, come on, really? Is this how it works? But what I want to do, and I've got some notes here for myself, is I want to talk about this ex nihilo fit. You should remember this. You will use this. So I'm going to try to do this in a way that hopefully you'll be able to say, okay, I can use that with somebody. Because what we're going to do is give what's called a rational argument for the existence of God. Then I'm going to show you an evidential argument that lays on top of it, and then a presuppositional argument that lays on top of even all of that. And so what we're going to see is there's these layers to how do we come to an understanding of the fact that the God of the Bible is God and does exist. So let's start with this one. I'm going to hold up this. This is my copy of the confession. Does this exist? Is this a figment of your imagination? If I throw it at you and hit you, you'll say, okay, no, it's not a figment of my imagination. Unless, of course, you have quite an imagination, and your imagination was that I was going to say, I'll throw this at you and you'll feel something. Philosophers actually tried to argue against the Christian understanding of ex nihilo fit by saying that things don't really exist. It's all imaginary. That everything that you see is in your own imagination. So there's actually only one imagination happening, and you can't tell whose it is because it's really probably yours. Or is it mine? Am I part of your imagination or are you part of mine? But that's the degree to which philosophers went to try to avoid the objectivity of this statement, out of nothing, nothing comes. So they would then argue that there isn't anything. René Descartes, have anybody heard of René Descartes? Does anybody know what he's attributed to saying? I think, therefore I am. René Descartes got caught up in the middle of that. That's not exactly the greatest argument, but what he was trying to do is show that things actually exist. He tried to show rationally, as opposed to dealing with physical, tangible world. Bear and I were talking about this yesterday. Instead of just saying, look, obviously this piano exists. I could run into it and it's going to hurt, drop it on me and I'm dead, right? These things exist. He tried to show rationally by using reason that he existed. I think, therefore I am. So he's arguing against philosophical beliefs that were absolutely silly. That the physical world doesn't exist. It's just a figment of your imagination. If that's the case, can I ask you, what's the point of anything? If it's all in your imagination, really? Believing that today is almost like believing in a flat earth. People who believe in a flat earth today, seriously, go on the internet and just watch the sun move and just tell yourself, really? The person could get on your phone, call somebody in China right now, and you'll find out that it's dark. Are we really a flat disk flipping around? And people who believe in a flat earth today, really, there's just no reason for it. Same thing with people who don't believe in physical reality. So this exists. This is a something. You exist. You are somethings. This eraser, this dry erase marker, is a something. If somethings, let's write down somethings up here. I'm going to make it into plural, some things. Some things exist. But if some things exist, what that means is there had to be a something from which all some things come. Because this statement, ex nihilo nihilo fit, says that out of nothing, if there's absolutely nothing, nothing comes. You can't get something out of absolute nothing. Now, when I say nothing, I don't mean mathematical zero. Mathematical zero is not nothing. By the way, I can have a negative 100 and a positive 100, and they give me what? If I add them together? Mathematical zero. If I have a scale and I put 100 pounds on one side and 100 pounds on another side, at an absolute point in the center, there is zero. The forces have balanced each other, and I have the scale even. That's not nothing. I still have something. There are people out there trying to figure out how the universe could actually come up to a mathematical zero and say, therefore, it's nothing. So out of nothing came something. That's absolute silliness. There's something. There's something. Even if we have a vacuum, around it is something. Out of nothing, nothing comes. If you have nothing, nothing gets there. So it's impossible, really, that anything exists if there's nothing. If at some point there was nothing. But then you ask yourself this question. Okay, at some point there was something. And that's where everything that exists came from. There was something. Where did that something come from? So then you say, well, okay, that something came from this. And so now you're here. Where did that come from? How far back do we go? How far back do we go to get to that something from which everything has come? That first something. How far back would you go? You got to keep going, right? And you keep going, and you keep going. Can you ever stop? If you're going to look for that something from which everything came, can you ever stop going back to find that? Because every time you get to what you think is the source, you have to ask yourself the question, where did it come from? What was the source of that? So, when we say that all some things that exist, and they do exist, have to come from something, because out of nothing, nothing comes, so there has to be something from which everything came. What can we know about that something? It has to be eternal. And you're not going to be able to see because of let's write it up here. It has to be eternal. Why does it have to be eternal? That something from which everything comes has to be eternal. Why? Otherwise, it came into being, and if it came into being, it can't come into being out of nothing. So therefore, it had to come into being out of something, and so then that's not the thing that we're looking for. So the something from which everything else came has to be eternal, which means it has to have no beginning. And if it has no beginning, and if it is itself without a beginning, then therefore it is also this word that we've talked about, ase. Does anybody remember what ase means? You taught on aseity. What does ase mean? Aseity would be an English ase in the Latin. What is that? Self-existent means of itself, of itself. So this thing that everything came from has to be eternal because it can't have something before it. And if it can't have something before it, it means it's not dependent on anything for its being, which means this thing, whatever this thing is, this something is ase, which means it has being in itself. It is being. And from it, all other being has come. No being can exist. No something. No thing can be without this thing. And this thing isn't dependent on anything because this thing is eternal. And if it's not the thing we're looking for. It's not the thing, it's just another something. If it's not eternal, if it doesn't have the power of being in itself, if it's not independent of everything because it's the first eternal thing, then all it is just another something. Yeah, I'm going to fall really close. I need a harness. Where's Bill? What we're going to see is that if this thing is eternal, which it has to be, if this thing is ase, which it has to be, it has being in itself, then it must also be immutable. Why would that be? Why can't this thing not change? Why would it need to be immutable? It's eternal. It's not dependent on anything. It has being in itself. So because it's independent of everything, it can't be changed by anything because it's before everything. Its being is in and of itself. It's not influenced by things because there is nothing when it exists. For all eternity, this something existed, and there was nothing else to exist but that. And so therefore, it's not changeable because it is itself. It doesn't get influenced by other things. Now, one could argue that this thing could will to change itself, but I haven't even said this thing has a will. So far, all we've proven is Parmenides, to some degree, that there is something that exists from all eternity. It is eternal, it is ase, it has the power of being in itself. And it is immutable. Now, the next question then, I think, is this. How do we argue from this thing that's eternal, ase, and has the power of being to God? How do we know that this just isn't some energy? This eternal something. How do we know that this thing is God? So there's one way we can do this, and that is we can now go from this rational argument to an evidential argument. When you look at the universe of some things, what do you see? When you look at the stars, when you look at the earth, when you look at nature, when you look at the human body, what do you see? Good.
I was going to say evidence of something that came before it.
You do, absolutely. You see evidence of something that came before it, so we see a succession. That's a good one. What else do you see? There's lots of things here. So think, I'm not looking for the one answer. Good. You see something created. How do you know? What is it that you see? Go baser. Okay, good. You see design. How do we know that? Good. Order. There's another one here for those of you who are more in the physics and other. We see and have discovered something called math. And that math, what does that math do? It describes the universe. It describes, I was talking to Bill, and we were talking about the harness and Ben, and I said, don't fight gravity, because when gravity decides to win, it always wins. The moment it decides to win, forget it. It is a law, a constant, and we know this, and mathematics actually describes it. We can describe our universe through mathematics. So there's like design. There's like, what we're starting to see here by design, order, math. What else do we see? What's that? Function. So we see function. So things have purpose, right? Purpose. Okay, some of you painters and musicians, what else do we see? Okay, good. Order. Let's put this with order and consistency. They're not the same thing, but they kind of go together. Rhythm. Good, rhythm. Artists, musicians. Okay, we see harmony. Beauty. Not only do we see beauty, but what's really weird is, and maybe we only see it, but we do see it. As human beings, we see beauty. We walk out in the springtime to a field full of fresh flowers, all these different colors and the way and we see beauty. We look at nebula in the universe out in space, and we see beauty. We see beauty all over the place in the things that have been made. We see order, design, function, harmony, beauty, mathematics. It's amazing to me how a scientist will use mathematics to explain the universe and then turn around and say that the universe wasn't created by an intelligent being. In other words, the mathematics is just chance. I don't understand how we can think we're so smart by figuring out the code. It's like I was walking down the street, I found a piece of paper with a code on it. I deciphered the code that interpreted something, and then said that code wasn't created by anybody. It just was random, something that just happened. That's kind of what we did. We have used this God-given intellect to discern the code of the universe, and then said that there was no intelligence behind the design of the universe with the code that we've used to figure it out. Does that sound strange to you? It's necessary for them. It's absolutely necessary, but it's strange. Our ability to find design, harmony, and beauty, and function and purpose in the universe is itself an evidence for the fact that this something that is eternal, ase, has being in itself, and is immutable, is also personal, is intelligent. So now we're talking about not a mystical force that's eternal, but a being that is intelligent, that is eternal, that designs things, that builds things. There's intelligence. There's aesthetics to this being. There's beauty. Not only are there things that have function, have you ever noticed that in creation there are things that have no function, just beauty? As far as we can tell at this point in time, we just look and say, what's the function? But it's beauty. So now we're talking about intelligence. Any questions or thoughts there? Any comments on that? When we think about God, and when we think about talking to somebody about God, ex nihilo nihilo fit, out of nothing, nothing comes. Unless you want to believe in the proven false understanding of spontaneous generation, which really was a philosophy designed to counter this things just spontaneously come. Parmenides, you're crazy. These things came about just pop, out of nothing. They just spontaneously generated. R.C. Sproul, loving R.C. Sproul, he says, philosophers finally realized that spontaneous generation was really false, but then they realized that that left them with no other alternative. So they came up with the philosophy of gradual spontaneous generation. So in other words, you can't have something spontaneously generate right now, but if you add another element to it, which is duration, it can spontaneously generate. So they would argue that out of nothing, nothing comes immediately, but out of nothing, nothing comes over a long period of time. How long do you think nothing has to sit in nothingness before it will turn into somethingness? Say it. Forever. Forever. Nothingness sits in nothingness forever before it turns into something, which means it will never turn into something. St. Thomas Aquinas also had an argument for the existence of God that philosophers tried to assail. In their assailing of his argument, they came up with counters, and the counter arguments were not so good. His was that everything has a cause. And if we say everything has a cause, the smart philosopher immediately says, okay, then that something that you're saying everything came out of has to have a cause, because you said everything has a cause. And so very quickly, Christians said, no, we didn't mean everything. We meant every effect has a cause. That's a true statement. Every effect has a cause. The somethings in the universe are effects. They are the outcome of a cause. But there is one who is not an effect. He is the first cause. That is the same thing as ex nihilo nihilo fit. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So therefore there must be an eternal ase something. And that eternal ase something is the first cause. So every effect has a cause. And if we follow it all the way back, and keep following it back, we have to get to the first cause. And if you are like Parmenides or most modern philosophers or scientists, and you simply want to say, I don't want to go there, is that very scientific? But to go there is to now step into the realm of theology. To go there is to say, this being exists, and this being is eternal, and this being is ase, and this being is the one who designed. And then to do that, guys, just to be honest, let's just put it in perspective. If you do that as a scientist, then you're basically saying those uneducated Christians are right. And that can't be. The uneducated Christians were right. There is a God who is personal, who is eternal and immutable, just as the Bible describes, and He created all things with design and intention and purpose and beauty. And He did all that. And that can't be allowed. So you can be guaranteed they're going to continue to find a way to try to overcome this. We're now, since Parmenides, at 2,500 years and counting. Let's go back even further, 3,500 years to Moses and counting, because Moses taught this exactly when he said, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, what? God, right? God created. In the beginning, God. Who is the eternal one, the something before which all things exist? In the beginning, God. So Moses, 3,500 years ago, wrote this down. Parmenides, another 1,000 years later, comes along and gets this down. And it hasn't been proven wrong since. And Stephen Hawking today is just now postulating the zero concept, that maybe there's a way in which something can create itself in a vacuum out of nothing. They're trying to do that right now, right in this day and age. I don't know, it's not Stephen Hawking now, but that's what he positioned was that there's this zero balance. 3,500 years later, and we still are struggling with that concept. Most scientists will just simply say, I don't want to go there. We can't know. Does anybody know the philosophies that came when this argument couldn't be assailed? What other philosophies came along? If you can't deny that there is a being who has power in itself to be, then what other philosophies would come along? What's that? Deism. Good. That being is out there away. It has nothing to do with us. Any others? How about agnosticism? What would that be? So we were talking about this at home a week or so ago. Atheism is the again as not God, meaning a negation of theism, so no God. Agnosticism is in front of the word gnosis, which is the Greek word for, does anybody know? Knowing, knowledge. So what is agnosticism? No knowledge. So okay, I can't argue that this being doesn't exist, so now I'm going to spend all my time arguing that you can't know this being. Then you get these really crazy, more popular culture, agnostic ideas about religion. And remember that, does anybody know the elephant illustration? Isn't that one great? Somebody says, well, religion, knowing God, it's like an elephant. And one person has hold of the leg, and another person has hold of the trunk, and another person has hold of one of those big ears, and another person has hold of the tail, and they're all describing this creature itself, but they all get a little different perspective. So Buddhism has a perspective, and Judaism has a perspective, and Christianity and Hinduism and Islam all have a perspective because they have a different part of the elephant. Except for one person, the person who came up with that illustration. What does that person have? They have a view of the whole elephant. Or otherwise, how would they know that you only have a leg and somebody else has a tail? Do you see what they're arguing from a position of omniscience? They're arguing from a position that there is a God and we can know him, but it just so happens that the religions don't. But I do. I know that they all have a piece. See how silly it gets? All right, let's look at some scriptures together. God's eternity. God's eternity means that God has no beginning. We saw in Psalm 90, verse 2, he is from everlasting. God's eternity means that God has no ending. He is, as we saw in Psalm 90, verse 2, to everlasting. So from everlasting to everlasting means that eternity is no beginning and no ending. Every other creature, everything that God has made, even angels and men who have immortality because God has given it to us, we who live forever have a beginning. We're not eternal. We may be immortal because God has given us immortality, for he alone has immortality in himself. He gives us that. We are creatures. He communicates to us a lastingness, an everlastingness, but it's in one direction, not the other direction. We don't have eternity. God has that. But having no beginning and having no ending is not sufficient to describe God's eternity. It would seem like that should be all that there is, but it's not. Because one of the things that would mean is that if we stop there, we might conclude that time is therefore also eternal, co-eternal with God. Because what we're doing is we're measuring God purely on the basis of time, no beginning and no ending. So theologians have, in the Christian history, since Augustine, have argued that, and probably before Augustine, because he doesn't come up with this stuff all on his own, that God is not only from everlasting to everlasting, but he is without succession of moments. Now how many of you ever heard that before? God is without succession of moments, a few of you. That means that God is without a past, a present, and a future. What that means is that God sits above time. Time actually starts when things were created. Because before God created anything, what was there? What was before God created? What was there? God. And how long had God been there? Wherever there is. How long? Forever, right? Forever and ever and ever. There was no time. Time is a succession of events. Time is the movement from one thing to another. The present is like this, and immediately it's past. Most of you are wishing this lecture would be past. It's past. It's right. It's moving. That's time. We're measuring time by a succession of events. God exists for all eternity. When God created things, he created time. But he, as we saw from Isaiah 57:15, inhabits eternity, which is that place where there is no past, present, and future. There is eternity. God does not have a succession of moments. Let's look at a verse to see this. If you would, turn with me to Psalm 102. And if you ever get a chance to talk to a Jehovah's Witness again at your door, you can take them to this verse. And if you explain to them that God has no succession, he is immutable and eternal, and they're like, wow, that's Jehovah. Then you can flip over to Hebrews chapter 1 and say, this is Jesus Christ. Look at these verses. Psalm 102, let's start verse 26. Or we'll start verse 25. Of old you founded the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. So now here's this beginning. God creates. Even they will perish. So they have a beginning and they'll have an ending. But you do what? You endure. You endure. All of them will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them and they will be changed. But you are what? The same. God's immutability and his eternity says that God doesn't have successions of moments. God sees all of eternity, all of time at one time. He sits above it, unchanged by it. God isn't changed from one moment to the next. He never learns anything about the future. He never has to react and change himself to the future. He doesn't look back in time to the past as if he somehow has moved on from something. God doesn't change. Here we see time changing. It's moving. It's moving forward. It's going from creation to perishing. And God just endures. God remains the same through all of it. If you would, flip over to Hebrews chapter 1. Because if we see that then, that this immutable God, this unchanging God, this eternal God, now we can look at verse 8 of chapter 1. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has appointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. And then here. You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. And they will become like an old garment, and like a mantle you will roll them up. Like a garment they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. That's what he's saying to the Son. How do we know that? How do we know he didn't change his argument? Because verse 13, but to which of the angels has he ever said? Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13:8. He is the one who never changes, who knows no succession of moments. He is the same forever. God says, I am the Lord, I change not. Malachi 3:6. James says, with God there is no variation or shadow of turning. Nothing changes with God. He is ever the same. What that means is that God sees all of eternity at one time. That doesn't mean he doesn't recognize the change of things. It means that God sees it all at one time. He sees everything in its proper relation. He is eternal and above time. Let me give you an example of this. We just have a couple minutes. In the scriptures, we know from Ephesians 1:11 that God works everything how? Does anybody finish that verse? He works all things, everything, after the counsel or pleasure of the counsel of his will. What's another theological term for the counsel of God's will? Anybody? Another theological term for the counsel of his will. Trinity was a good one because you're thinking counsel. That was pretty awesome. But a different word. I like that one. What's a synonym for the counsel of his will? Predestination. His decree. His decree. When do you think God's counsel, the counsel of God's will, started? It didn't. It didn't. Why? Because he is eternal and he is immutable. It didn't start. We can't think of it starting. How long has God's counsel been? It's been as long as God has been. It's his counsel. How much of what's happens in the universe was part of that counsel at the very beginning? How much? All of it. Everything that is and everything that takes place was already in the divine counsel at the beginning. But there is no beginning to it because it's God's. And God has no beginning. So if God's decree incorporates all things, he works all things after the counsel of his will, and if his will is his will, God does not change, so it's not like one day he says, oh, that's interesting, let me do this. Can't happen, right? Can't happen. That's imperfection. That's God that's not I change not, that's I changed. So if that's God, then that means that God sees all of time at one time. He planned all that takes place in time at one time. It's not that Jesus died tomorrow or last Thursday. Jesus died 2,000 years ago in time. And God knows that. But God sees it all as one. Because it's one plan, one decree, all happening according to his one will. That doesn't mean everything is one. Things are real. Things are different. I drop this, it falls, it hits the ground at a different time from when I held it in my hand. But God's will is one will because he sits above all things. That'll blow your mind. I think that's enough. If you ask yourself, what does this all mean and why is this important? I would ask you to look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 26 and 27. Why is God's eternity important? Why is eternity more important than right now? But why does right now matter for eternity? Matthew 16, 26 and 27. I'm done. Any questions or comments? It's about 10 till, so. Anybody want to add anything? Or anything just kind of stuck in your craw you want to bring out?
When you said you were doing your RC scroll impression, I was waiting for when
I was going to do Peter, the Columbo one too. Marcy Sproul does it. He's like a Columbo. Anything? Anybody want to add? That was just to touch the surface of eternity. We could spend hours and hours digging deeper into what does it mean for no succession of moments, digging into that deeper. I would encourage you to do some study on that if your interest is really piqued. Let me know, because I have some good books you can take a look at, just to kind of think about what have Christians always thought about this. And this is old. This is not new. This isn't just Reformation theology. This goes way, way, way back, and it's been consistent. As I said, the Lateran Council in the 12th and the 13th century, same description of God. Okay, thanks everybody.